Hello again and welcome back to another episode of Adding Game Sounds, where today we're going to be looking at our final parameter for our music event for the 4th level, which is the fret level parameter. So we're going to be looking at how we can change our music whenever the player is near an enemy, and when the player is, we want to change it so it intensifies and, you know, dramatizes the scene. Now, if you haven't seen any of the previous episodes where we've been looking at implementing our interactive music, make sure you check them out. I'll have them linked in the top right corner of this video for you to watch. And also, if you want any of the scripts from those videos or this video, which I'll be showing later on today, you can come to scottgamesounds.com and you'll find a page called Scripts and Assets, where you can copy them basically. I'll have all the scripts from my videos here. You just click on a script you want and it'll bring up like a little text file basically, and you can just copy it into your project, saving you having to copy it by eye basically through these videos. Okay, so let's start by quickly reminding ourselves how our music works. So whenever our cursor is at any one of these 4 sections of music here, we can change our fret level from 0 to 1. And when that happens, all of the tracks that you see here will fade out, and the tracks underneath them on the tense track will fade in. So if I quickly play section 1 for you, let's have a listen to how that sounds. Okay, so pretty simple stuff. All we need to do is hook this parameter up to our script that we looked at in the last lesson, and see how we can use that to monitor the distance between our player character, Ellen, and the enemies in this game. So just like in the last lesson, we're going to be looking at the FMOD music level 4 script, which we attach to the background music player. So let's open that up and take a look at some of the edits we need to make. Okay, so as you can see here, these are all the changes that we've been making in the last 2 episodes. But if we scroll down a bit, I've added a new section basically, and I've kind of separated it from all the old stuff that we looked at in the last lessons, as you can see here by this big gap I've made, just because a lot of this stuff doesn't really interact with the stuff we have looked at previous lessons. And there are some new concepts here, so I thought I'd separate them visually to help us kind of focus in on what we're looking at today, which is everything here. So let's start by looking at the first variable we've got here. So this variable here is of the FMOD music level 4 reference data type, and I've called it instance. Now the reason why I've made a variable of the same type as the class that we're writing our script in is for 2 reasons. The first reason is to turn this script into a kind of manager script, because this is playing our one and only music track in this scene. I want to make sure that there's not going to be any other copies of this class attached to any other game objects in this scene, or attached to the same game object. So to do that, I'm going to store an instance of this FMOD music level 4 script in its entirety, by the way, the whole thing, not just this section here. We're going to store an instance of it inside instance, and then as we'll look at here in a little bit, I'm going to make sure that that's the only instance that can ever be loaded into this scene. The second reason is so that other classes within our scene can access this class and interact with it, which we'll soon see in a bit. But to give you a brief idea now, basically we want the enemies that are going to be, you know, found throughout this level to be able to interact with this script and tell us when they're close to our player, basically. Now in the last lesson we looked at a few different ways on how to reference different scripts attached to different game objects, and one of those ways was using a singleton method, which is basically what I've done here. So let's talk about it in a bit more detail. Now at the moment, our variable is currently empty. It's of the FMOD music level 4 data type, but there's no reference to our class stored within it. That's where this function comes in, the awake function. So in case you don't know, the awake function works similarly to the start function, which we've looked at many times. The start function runs as soon as the first frame of the game is shown on screen. However, the awake function runs a little bit before that. It basically runs when the game is first loading up and booting up the first level. So it's in here that we're going to store a reference to our class inside our instance variable. So as soon as the awake function is called, an if statement is run. So we check to see if our instance variable is equal to null. Null is basically another word for empty. We use it for reference data types such as this, and if there's no reference stored within a reference data type variable, which there isn't in our case, it's considered null, empty. There's nothing going on within it. So if our instance variable is null, which it will be, we're going to set the instance variable to this class. So now our instance variable contains an instance or a copy or a reference to this entire class here, the FMOD music level 4 class that we've created. Now, like I said earlier, one of the reasons we're using this variable is to make sure that we only ever have one instance of this class loaded into our scene at once, because obviously we don't want two pieces of music playing at the same time. And that's where this else statement comes in. So once the if statement has made its checks, the else statement will run. Now, if this if statement is run and the instance variable doesn't equal null, then that means there's a reference already stored inside that variable of the FMOD music level 4 data type. That means we don't want to set another reference to it. Instead, we want to destroy this instance of this class that's attached, as well as the game objects it's attached to, which in this case could be the background music player, but it also could be another class that we might accidentally attach this script to. Now, you might be thinking that's a bit silly and unnecessary. We don't need to include this because I know I'm not going to go adding the FMOD music player script to other game objects in our scene. That would be pointless. We don't need to. And yeah, you're right, you won't be adding this to other game objects, but this is a common practice that you will find in bigger projects where there's a lot more going on and a lot more scripts where only one instance of it is needed. For example, scene managers or audio managers or any kind of manager really. It's common to see this kind of practice be put into place where they make sure copies of it isn't included within the same scene. So just look at the code that we've written in the awake function as a little safety precaution, just to make sure that there is only ever one copy of our FMOD music level 4 class attached to a game object within our scene. This is also important because our enemies, which I mentioned earlier, are going to be checking how close they are to the player. And if they're close enough, they're going to be using this script to tell our music to change. If we have multiple copies of this script attached to different game objects in our scene, it's going to be harder for them to interact and access this information in this class. Now, speaking of the information they're going to access, that would be everything inside this function here, the change threat level function. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. So this is completely designed to be called by a script attached to our enemies throughout our scene whenever they get close to the player. Now, whenever they call this function, they're going to give us some data in the form of a boolean, so either true or false. Basically, that will be depending on if they're close enough to the player. If they are close enough, they're going to give us the value of true. And if they're not, then they'll give us the value of false. And then that value we're going to store inside this variable we've declared inside our function's parameter brackets, the attacking player Boolean variable. So as soon as this function is called, a value is going to be stored inside attacking player. So the first thing we're going to do is check that variable and see which value it was given. Now, if it was given a value of true, that means an enemy is close to our player. So we're going to set this other variable, number of enemies attacking player. We're going to basically increment it by 1. Now, this is a variable of the integer data type, meaning it stores numbers. And as you can see, we've declared that up here. So to increment it, or basically just add 1 to it, we can write the double plus sign next to it. As well as this, if change threat level is called, but the value that's put inside attacking player is false, then that means the else statement will be triggered instead of the if statement, because the if statement is checking only if that variable is true. So if it's false, then we're going to set number of enemies attacking player to, or rather we're going to -1 from it essentially, as you can see here by putting 2 minus signs next to the variable like we did with the plus signs, we're minusing 1 from it instead of adding 1. So basically everything going on inside the if and the else statements are counting how many enemies in our scene are within a certain distance to our player. And if they are, we consider them to be hostile. You know, we're assuming they're attacking the player. The reason why is because the Chomper enemies and the Spitter enemies in this game, they trigger and they do attack the player based on distance. So they have their own system where they calculate how close they are to the player, and if they're close enough, then they'll start to engage and attack. Now, going back to our music in FMOD, we only want to ever set the threat level from 0 to 1 if there is at least one enemy attacking the player. And if there's no enemies attacking the player, then we want to set it from 1 to 0. Now, the reason why we're counting how many enemies are attacking our player at once is so that we can specifically make the change to our parameter if the number of enemies goes from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. And if there is any other change, say for example, the amount of enemies goes from 1 to 2, we don't want to make the change. If we weren't counting the number of enemies attacking our player and just made a check for distance, then every time an enemy got close, we would be changing our, we'd be changing our variable, which is obviously unnecessary. So by counting the total number of enemies, we can make sure that we make the change to this parameter only when we go from 0 to 1 enemies attacking, or vice versa. Which leads us on to the second half of our change threat level function. So now that an enemy has got close to or moved away from our player and triggered the change threat level function, and then once we've made a change to the total amount of enemies close to the player, we want to check that number and see, based on that number, whether or not we need to change our parameter in FMOD. And the way we're going to do this is with a switch statement. Now, we could do this with an if statement, but the reason why I'm using a switch statement is because we haven't really used them yet on this channel, and they're a really useful tool, especially when needing to make a change based on multiple conditions. Even though there's only 2 conditions we ever really need to check for in this scenario, I thought it'd be good to kind of explain how they work. So, they are very similar to an if statement. You feed them a condition, and then based on that condition, you can basically perform a certain amount of actions or make a certain amount of changes to different properties in your game. Now, as mentioned, in our case, the condition we want to check is the number of enemies attacking player variable, and the change we want to make is to our parameter in FMOD, the threat level parameter. So to use a switch statement, you first write the keyword switch followed by a pair of brackets, and then inside the brackets you feed them the variable you want to monitor, which I've done here. Then you create a body like you would with a function, and inside the body you're going to basically write out a list of what would happen depending on certain values that variable could be set to. So to make a change, you write the keyword case within the body, followed by the value you want to make a change if the variable is ever set to that value. So the first one I've done is for the value of 1. If there is 1 enemy attacking the player, then I know I want to set my threat level parameter in FMOD from 0 to 1. Which is what I've done here. So using the music event instance variable, which we set up a few episodes ago, which is holding an instance of our music event, we can use the set parameter by name function to access our parameter, which is called threat level, and then set it to a value of 1. Now, it's important using switch statements whenever you've finished making a change to a property based on a value of the variable you're checking, to end the kind of section you're writing in with the keyword break. So following that, I've made a new section, which I've started with the keyword case. This time we're checking to see if the variable is ever set to 0. And if it is, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to access our event through music. We're then going to set the value of the threat level parameter, this time to 0, because we know that there's no enemies near enough to the player attacking it. And there we go, we've now got a little system checking the amount of enemies near the player and then interacting with our parameter in FMOD. So to sum up, this function here, the change threat level function, is going to be called whenever an enemy either gets near to or moves away from our player. When they do either of those 2 things, a value is going to be stored inside the attacking player variable. We're then going to check that variable for its value. If it's true, we'll then add a number to the number of enemies attacking player variable. By the way, I should say when this game or the scene starts, this variable starts at a value of 0 because we know that when the game starts, there's no enemies around us. So, you know, that's a safe assumption to make. So starting at 0, this function is then called. If it's true, we know that an enemy is near, so we add 1 to it. However, if it's called and this variable is false, then we know an enemy has moved away. Therefore, we minus 1 from the variable. Then, once we've made a change to the variable, we then check its new value. And if the value is 1, then we're going to set our music variable, our music parameter in FMOD fret level from 0 to 1. If it's 0, then we do the opposite. We change it from 1 to 0. And if it's any other number, if it's say 2, 3, 4, or 5, because we haven't made a case or a section in our switch statement for that value, no change to the parameter will be made, which is exactly what we're after. Okay, so that is pretty much all the changes to our music script. Now it's finally time to look at the script attached to our enemies and how they're going to be checking whether or not they're close enough to our player. Now, when we're looking at our level inside Unity's editor, you can see there's no enemies actually loading in. And that's because there are basically objects scattered throughout the level that are designed to spawn in the enemies when the scene starts. So instead of trying to find an enemy in our scene, what we need to do is find an enemy prefab inside the assets of our game. So as you can see, I've clicked on my project tab and I've searched for the name of one of the enemies, which is the Chomper. What I'm going to do is then find the Chomper Prefab, which is this one here. You can also check because it says .prefab at the bottom here, so you know what type of file it is. Now I'm going to open up the prefab, and then we can take a look at all of the scripts attached to all of the game objects that will be loaded in when this enemy is loaded in by one of our spawners. Now, a couple of lessons ago, when we were looking at adding sounds to these enemies, we added this script to the prefab, the enemy audio script. So I thought this would be a perfect time to reuse this script to interact with our music player to, again, check the distance between these enemies and our player. So let's edit the script and take a look at it. Okay, so just like with our music player script, I've separated this into two sections. Everything you see here is old. This is what we looked at when we were adding footstep sounds and attacking sounds to our enemies, but everything beneath it in this section here is what we're going to be looking at today, because everything here interacts with our FMOD music level 4 script. So let's see what's going on. First of all, there's quite a few variables we've declared, so let's quickly go through these and see what they do. We've got a float variable called engage player distance, and that's set to 7. We've got another one called forget player distance, and that's set to 10. And these values are constants. I've basically decided that these are going to be the units of measurement that I'm going to be checking for, which will determine whether or not I consider the player close enough to be hostile and engaging, our player, trying to attack them. So if an enemy is within 7 units of our player, I'm going to consider that as an attack, and then therefore want to make a change to the music with. However, if the player, or rather if the enemy or the player, moves away from each other so much that the distance is now a unit or a value of 10, then I want to make another change to the music. I want to say that the player or the enemy is now no longer attacking the player. Now, if you wish, you can make changes to these values yourself. They don't have to be 7 or 10. This is just something I felt quite, I felt comfortable with. Testing out this script in the game, these kind of distances felt right to me, especially when watching the animations of the enemies, which you'll soon see later on. Next, we've got two Boolean variables, one called near player and another called previous near player. Now, the near player variable is simple enough. Whenever the enemy is within 7 units of our player, we're going to set it to true. It's now near the player. However, if it then moves more than 10 units away from the player, we're going to set it to false. So we're going to basically use this to track whether or not the enemy is near the player. This value, by the way, will soon be sending back into our FMOD music level 4 script, and this is the value that will be then going into the attacking player variable once change threat level is called. Now, previous near player does the same thing. It checks to see if the enemy is near the player or not. However, we're using it to check whether or not the enemy is near the player, or was near the player rather, within the previous frame that ran, whereas near player will be using to check the current frame. The reason why is because we want to check for the exact frame when the enemy makes that change from being at a distance of greater than 7 to a distance of less than 7, because that's the frame we then want to call our change threat level function at. And we also have a variable called damage of the damageable reference data type. Now we're going to use this to monitor our enemy's health. Obviously, if the enemy dies, then we want to consider that as if the enemy is no longer attacking the player and tell our FMOD music level 4 script that. So in order to monitor our enemy's health, we want to check the condition of a certain value, which is holding that health, inside the damageable script, which is also attached to this game object. That variable is called current health. Finally, we have a variable called this enemy died. And this is going to work alongside the damage variable. So if the enemy's health is greater than 0, they're alive. So that means that this enemy died is set to false. However, if it becomes 0, then that obviously means they've died, and then this variable is set to true. Okay, so let's now move on to the functions, starting with the start function, which we know runs on the first frame that this scene starts on. So the first thing we want to do is, using our empty damage variable, we want to store a reference to our damageable script that is also attached to this enemy. So to do that, we just set the variable to GameObject.getComponent damageable. GetComponent obviously is a function that allows us to get specific components attached to our game object. So from here on out, we can now use our damageable variable to access other variables that are declared and stored within the damageable script. Next is the update function, which we know is run on every frame of the game. Now, before we look at the majority of what's going on inside the update function, I want to draw your attention to the very last thing we're doing in it, which is setting the value of the previously near player variable to whatever the near player variable is currently at. Now, this is a method we've done in a few of our different scripts in this series. For example, I think we did it with the player when we were checking whether or not they were touching the ground or not, but I'll quickly explain again how this works. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got two variables basically doing the same thing, checking how close the enemy is to the player. However, one we're using to reference the current frame, and the other we're using to reference what the condition was in the frame that ran before the current frame. Now, inside all of the code that I've highlighted in blue, that's basically where we're going to be setting the value of near player. Depending on what goes on within our scene, all this script here will set near player to either true or false. So let's say, for example, that all this code determined that the enemy is near the player and therefore near player is set to true. Well, then we come down to the final line of the update function and we say, okay, we now want to set previously near player to the same value as near player. So now they're both set to true. Because this is the last section or the last piece of code in the update function, we can now assume that this frame, the current frame we're looking at, has ended after this code has, been run, because now the update function is finished. So now a new frame is run and the update function is run again. So once again, all the code here checks whether or not the enemy is near or not to the player. Well, now let's say hypothetically that the enemy has moved away from the player, therefore setting near player to false. Well, we now know that this is the frame that the enemy has made the change from being close to the player to being far away from the player. The reason why is because checking both the values of near player and previous near player, we find that they both contain different values. Near player was just set to false, but previous near player is still set to true from the previous frame. So it's at this moment that we will then call our change threat level function from within the FMOD music level 4 script, which we'll look at in more detail in a second. But continuing on with this hypothetical scenario, we finish up using all the code inside the update function, and we once again come back to the last line in it, previous player and near player. So now that near player is now false, previous player is changed from true to false. So that means when the next update function is run in the next frame, we can again use previously near player to check the status of our enemy from the last frame. So now that we understand how that works, let's dive into everything in this highlighted blue section and see how we determine whether or not the enemy is close to the player. First, we use an if statement and we check to see if the enemy is alive. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if the enemy is dead and if the enemy's health is less than 0, it doesn't matter whether or not they're close to the player or not. We know for a fact they're not attacking our enemy. So before we check their distance, we want to make sure that they are alive. So to do that, we use our damage variable and we check the current health variable, which is stored inside our script. Let's go back into Unity quickly. Our damageable script, which we're references, which, as you can see, is here, current health. So we check to see if that value is greater than 0, and if it is, we can run all of the code inside this section here to check how close the enemy is to the player. So if the enemy is alive, we're going to run another if statement, this time checking the distance. And the way we do that is using the distance function we looked at in the last lesson. So in case you haven't seen it, I'll quickly sum up. The distance function takes two values or two coordinates, and then from that it produces us a single value which gives us our distance. So the first set of coordinates that we need to feed it is the coordinates of our enemy itself. So to do that, that's nice and easy. We simply access the transform component attached to our enemy, which is up here, and we do that by writing transform with a lowercase t. And then we access the position variable within it, which, as we know, holds a coordinate which determines the location of our enemy within our scene. Once we've done that, we then want to access our player and find out the player's position, or the player's coordinates, and then give that to our function. And to do that, we access the player instance variable, which is inside the player character class, which we know is obviously attached to our player, and then through that we can access the transform component and then the variable position attached to the transform component. Now this is something we did, or in fact this is the exact same thing we did in the last episode, because obviously the FMOD music level 4 script is not attached to our player, it's on its own independent game object. So to access that, we looked at a variable that is within the player character class that is both static and is a singleton, meaning we know that there is basically only one ever instance or one of that variable existing in our scene at once, meaning we don't have to access a specific game object. If I go back to our hierarchy tab, we don't have to access a specific game object acting as our player. We can just tell our script to find that variable because we know there's only one instance of it, and by doing that we can access the position of our player's game object. So now that we've got that value, we now need to check whether or not it's greater than or less than our values we set up here. So the first thing we're going to do is see if it's less than the engaged player distance variable, which we set to 7. So if the distance is less than 7, our enemy is basically within range of our player to start attacking it, and therefore we want to call that function we looked at earlier inside the FMOD music level 4 script. First thing we do, because we now know that the enemy is near the player, is set near player to true. Next, we use another if statement, and this time we check to see whether or not the value of previously near player and near player is not the same, essentially, which is what the exclamation mark and the equal sign here both mean. So if previously near player does not equal the same value as near player. Now let's say on our previous frame that the enemy was not close enough to the player to run this if statement. However, now they are. They've just become within range of 7 and our if statement is triggered. Well, because near player is true and previously near player is false, that means the contents within this if statement is going to be run. So as you can see here, change threat level is being executed, and we're also executing a debug.log command to basically tell us that this is working inside the console tab of Unity, which is actually optional. You don't have to include this, you can remove it, but this was helping me visualize what's going on in my script so I could see that everything was working. So our function is called. However, let's assume that the next frame is now run and the enemy is still within our range of 7. Well, as we mentioned earlier, we now know that previously near player is going to be also set to the same value as near player, which is true, which means that when we come to this if statement, they now both equal true, which means that this function here is not going to be run a second time. So as I explained earlier, this system of having two variables, checking the condition of our current frame and our previous frame, help us to make sure we don't execute our function more than necessary. Again, we only want to execute it when our enemy goes from being too far away to within range, and not every time or every frame that they are within range. So now let's look at this line here and see how we actually execute our function. Well, it actually works in the same way that we execute, or rather, we check the variable position attached to the transform component that's attached to our player game object, but how we access the game object via the player instance variable within the player character class. Essentially, we're using a singleton. Now let's quickly go back to FMOD Music Level 4 and take a look once again at the instance variable we set up earlier. Now as you can see, After the variable, I've added this little section here. I've added a get and a set section. Now, get and set kind of work similarly to how public and private protect our variables. Obviously, we know that a public variable can be accessed by other classes, however, a private one cannot. Well, get and set kind of do the same thing, except they give you a bit more functionality to work with. Now, as you can see, I've followed up the variable with the word get, which basically means that other scripts, other classes, can get this variable. However, following get, I've written private set. Now, this basically means that whilst other classes can get this variable, they can't change the reference within it or the value within it, because set is been made private, which basically means only this script here, the one that declared the variable, can set its value or its reference in this case. So basically, by writing get private set, we've turned the instance variable into a read-only variable. So other scripts can access it and read the value or the information within it, but they can't change it. I've also made this variable static, which, as we know, means that there can only ever be one instance of it in our scene. So by combining these two properties together, it means that we can access anything within, well, anything public anyway, within the FMOD music level 4 script from another class simply by referencing the class type and then the variable instance, which is public, and as I mentioned earlier, can be got by any other class but not set. So that's exactly what I've done here in order to trigger or activate our change threat level function. We've written the name of our class, which is FMOD music level 4. We then access the instance variable within it, which, as we already know, holds a reference to the class and holds a single instance to it in our scene specifically. And then using that, we can access the function within the class, which is change threat level. Again, that is a public function, so we know we can access that. And then once we tell it to activate or trigger, we need to feed it a value. Remember, we've got a variable, a Boolean variable, inside the parameter brackets, meaning that a value needs to be fed into it whenever this function is triggered. So the value we want to feed is basically going to be whatever value is in near player, which in our case is true. So to sum up, if the enemy's health is greater than 0 and they are close enough to our player, they're within the 7 range, then we want to set near player to true, check to make sure that they weren't close enough to our player in the previous frame, and if they weren't, then we want to trigger our change threat level function, feeding it the value within near player, which is true, which is going to set attacking player to true as well. Then once this happens, the number of enemies attacking player is going to be upped by 1, and potentially we're going to trigger our switch statement, which may or may not activate our music, depending again whether or not there's any other enemies close enough to our player. Next, let's take a look at this part here, the else if statement. So we're now again using the same function, the distance function, to check the distance between our enemy and our player. However, this time we're specifically checking to see if that value is greater than the forget player distance, which, as you know, we set to 10. If it is greater, then we want to change near player to false, and again we want to make the check to see whether or not the enemy was near to the player in the previous frame. Now, because we know that near player is false, we want to check to see if previously near player is ever different from near player, which obviously must be true. So if it is true and near player is false, then we know again that difference has been made. The enemy has gone from being close to the player to far away, meaning we want to trigger the change threat level function again, but this time near player is going to be false. So with that information, when we trigger the function, attacking player is going to be false, and the number of enemies attacking player is going to be minus by 1. And then again, depending on the total number, we may or may not change the value of our parameter in FMOD. So that's everything that happens if the enemy's health is greater than 0. However, if it's less than 0, and therefore the enemy's died, then we're going to run this section here, inside this else statement. Now again, just like with our contents inside the if statement, we want to make sure that we only trigger the change threat level once, and we're not triggering it on every frame that the enemy is dead on. So that's what we use the this enemy died variable for, to make sure that we're only executing these commands on that change between frames. So on the very first frame that our enemy's health drops to 0 at, the else statement is triggered, and the if statement within it is also triggered. So we check to see if the enemy is near the player, and check to see if the this enemy died variable is false. So if near player is true and this enemy is false, that means the enemy is near the player, but this if statement hasn't been triggered yet, because as you can see, the only time we set the value of this enemy died is within it. So because we know the if statement hasn't triggered yet, we can activate it essentially and we can call the change threat level function one more time. Then once we've done that, we can also change the value of this enemy died to true, meaning that on the next frame, when again else will be triggered because the enemy's health is still below 0, we'll come to this if statement here, but this time this enemy died will be true, and therefore the contents within this if statement won't be triggered. So we know that this is only ever going to happen once. Now we want to make sure that we don't trigger this if the enemy is far away from the player. Obviously we could, from a distance, shoot the enemy. Let's say for example that the enemy is, the distance between the enemy and the player is greater than 10. So we could shoot the enemy from a distance of greater than 10, kill them, and obviously that would mean that the enemy is dead and the health is low 0. However, we don't want to execute the change threat level function if that's the case. The reason why is because that the enemy was never close enough to the player to trigger the contents within this first if statement, and therefore adding a value to the number of enemies attacking player variable. So if we did trigger this without all of this being triggered, we'd be minusing a value from this count, which never added one in the first place. Essentially, we could end up in the minus numbers. And so that's why this is only ever set to false if near player was previously already true. Obviously, if the enemy was near the player, then near player would be set to true, and we'd know for a fact that we would have incremented number of enemies attacking player by 1 accounting for that enemy. So that's why we change threat level if we kill the enemy when the enemy is near the player. And with that, that is everything to do with our scripts. Hopefully that made sense, because there was a lot to explain there and there was a lot of concepts going on. As always, you're more than welcome to let me know if that didn't make sense. But now it's time to basically, let's have a listen to it. Let's check out what all that hard work was for, and let's see how it works inside our game. Okay, here we are in the game. So I'm going to go find myself some enemies and then demonstrate how the music changes. Okay, as you can see here, I'm pretty close to some enemies now, so let's see what happens when I get within range. There we go, we hear the music change. And now if I defeat the final enemy, the music changes back. So let's keep going through this game. Let's have a listen to how the music changes in each section of the level. So this is obviously section 1. Let's move on to section 2. Okay, so there's some enemies to our right. Let's have a listen what happens if I get close to them. Now what I'm going to do is actually keep these alive and come back to them. There we go. So you can hear how the music changes on, distance again. So if we get closer and if we move far away, it changes. I also want to keep them alive because we're going to run into them again later on for a different section of the music. So here we are entering section 3. And the music changes again. There we go. So you can even hear how if the enemy, or rather if the player dies, because the player is now no longer close to the enemy, the music changes back. So I'm going to quickly make my way back over to that section of the level. Okay, here we are entering the final section, section 4. Okay, so this is the section obviously where the closer we get to our goal, the more intense our music gets. But let's have a listen to what happens if we get near some enemies whilst that happens. So as you can hear, the music also intensifies. And with that, we've just heard all the different sections to our music for this level. And there we go, with that, we're finally done with the music, or the interactive music for level 4 of our 2D game kit. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope this has given you some ideas as to how you can approach not only designing your interactive music for different games and different levels, but also how you can go about implementing it as well. So yeah, like I said, I hope you've enjoyed. Let me know in the comments down below if anything wasn't clear, or if there's anything in the future you'd like to see from this channel in general. And yeah, I think this video's gone on long enough. So with that, I've been Henry Scott. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.